One of the most controversial aspects of economic globalization in recent years has been the offshoring of jobs. That is, when a multinational corporation or a domestic company sends jobs overseas by setting up production facilities in another country with negative consequences for the communities, for the workers, and so forth. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about how to think about this decision of firms about how and where to produce. The where is going to be whether they decide to produce something domestically or in a foreign country. How they produce is whether or not they do it within the firm or with at an arm's length. In other words, with contracting with another company to provide components or the product themselves in order for this multinational to sell the product to another market. So we have the decision of say some domestic company to produce either domestically or in a foreign country, within the firm or external to the firm. Now if a firm decides to do all of the activities in-house, this is a traditional structure of a firm, and one that is implicit in a lot of the things that we've done in this class so far. That you've got a company that maybe buys or hires workers or hires capital, but it's all done within that firm. And that's certainly, in many instances, in fact the vast majority of firms do all of their stuff domestically. They make it, they assemble it, they market it, they do everything domestically, maybe sell it internationally, but it's done within purely within the firm inside the domestic in a domestic content. A domestic firm can also take some of its activities that it traditionally does in-house and outsource it domestically. Now you see, I'm using the word outsource here in a way that's slightly different than in a lot of common parlance. I'm going to talk about outsourcing as when a firm does something outside of the firm that it used to do internally. So that, for example, Ford Motor Company now buys auto parts from Delphi, which used to be part of Ford. So there are instances where you'll have a domestic firm decide not to produce it themselves, but instead contract with another company, another domestic company, to do what they used to do. Firms do this with accounting services or human resource services, all sorts of different things that they find it's easier to have somebody else do that. Now, this type of outsourcing is not particularly controversial, in large part because you've got one domestic activities that used to happen here that happen in another firm, so there's no net change in overall employment. But you still may have people that used to work here inside the large company that now have to compete with lower wage workers in Texas or South Carolina or some such. So it's not as if there are no consequences, it's just less controversial. So that's the domestic firm deciding whether or not to do something within the firm or external to the firm. You also have a decision of the domestic firm to take the activity and send it abroad. If the domestic company decides to take its operations and move it abroad, maintaining control, maintaining full authority over all the aspects of the firm, that is what is called FDI, or foreign direct investment. Firm's just doing part of the activities abroad, but it's still a Ford plant in Canada or in Mexico. Now, the final category is when you have a firm deciding to take its activities abroad, and this would be foreign outsourcing. Now, a lot of people will think about these two things as offshoring. This activity used to happen domestically, it now happens externally, either inside the company or at arm's length transaction with, say, a Chinese firm. So Apple, for example, employs or buys components from foreign, say Malaysian or Chinese components manufacturers to assemble it under Apple's name. So they're outsourcing the production to another firm. But this offshoring tends to be the part that's most controversial in a domestic context. I think because you have the jobs no longer in the United States but somewhere else. Now here the profits may be maintained within the domestic company, but the jobs aren't necessarily in the United States, they're someplace else. Here are some of the profits for some of the activities stay totally within the foreign firm. So this is a useful way to think about the different possibilities that firms face when making decisions in this modern world. Now, I'd also like to talk about this decision about choosing the foreign activity to undertake. And when I talk about benefits, I'm talking about the benefits to the company. Okay, so you can probably come up with a number of these on your own, but for example, they may have lower input costs. They may have access to raw materials in the foreign country that are cheaper than in the home market. They may have lower wage costs. Workers are cheaper, adjusted for their productivity and output, than a domestic alternative. You may get access to the foreign market if you set up activities abroad. Now, what do I mean by that? You might have, for example, a chance to avoid tariffs on your goods sent from the United States to Brazil if you set up operations in Brazil. So this is another reason why you might want to do the activities there, because you don't have to worry about these tariffs. You also don't have to worry about transporting the products from the United States to Brazil. The products are already there. So they're broader trade costs, not just tariffs. Okay. You might also have lower regulatory costs. Now, this is certainly one of the most controversial. So if you think about claims that the labor standards are lower in developing countries, maybe environmental standards, that can lower the cost of production for the U.S. multinational, and so these are incentives to potentially set up the activities abroad. So these are the benefits, but it's not all positive. There's some real costs associated with doing this as well, and it's important to think about those costs when thinking about whether or not a domestic firm will actually do this. Very important. You set up shop abroad, and that would be the case whether it's foreign direct investment or you're purchasing components from a foreign firm at arm's length. You got to monitor what's going on abroad. You've got to. It's not as easy to check up on things to make sure that the quality is right, that things are running the way you want to. There are language issues. There are time zone differences. There are all sorts of things that are non-trivial when setting up an activity in a foreign country. You also have what's called a hold-up problem with arm's length activities. What do I mean by that? Okay, so you say you got a contract with a foreign firm to deliver your components. They don't do it. They just don't live up to their contract. In the U.S., there's a well-established judicial system that allows you to take them to court, to sue them. Let's say that you are, that they owe you money. There's a refund for something. They're debtors to you. There are very well-established rules about collecting debts in the United States. That may not be so easy abroad, and at the very least it'll be different. And so that can raise some uncertainty associated with this. More broadly, there's regulatory uncertainty. In the United States, we have a very well-established rule of law. There are regulations published by the federal government or state governments. There are comment periods. There are ways in which that can be changed. The rules as written, broadly speaking, are adhered to. Not always, but broadly speaking, they are. A lot of developing countries, it's kind of a random process. You may not have to deal with these regulations if you know the right guy. And they'll turn an eye if you can contact the right person. And so this regulatory uncertainty and arbitrary nature, that is a downside to operating abroad. You also have the distinct possibility, especially under foreign direct investment, of expropriation. What do I mean by that? You've got a foreign government that decides to nationalize the oil industry. It happens. And if you're a multinational, you've got billions of dollars sitting in the foreign country, and the foreign government says, well, we're just, it's a national security concern. We've got a national economic crisis. We now take it. And maybe we'll give you compensation. Maybe we don't. Maybe we don't give you enough compensation. But there's always that risk associated with this. And this does happen on a periodic basis. There's some prominent examples involving Argentina in recent years, involving Spanish companies, where the Spanish company's not getting compensated for the decision of the, or they allege that they're not getting proper compensation. You also have exchange rate risk. The U.S., well, everything's in dollars. If the dollar's value rises against the pound, doesn't matter to you, unless you have foreign activities. If you set up shop in Britain and the value of the British pound changes relative to the U.S., your prices can be your profits can be very different. So you've got these benefits and costs from these foreign activities, and sometimes the costs outweigh the benefits, sometimes the benefits outweigh the costs. Now, one of the things that you'll notice here, that only one of these issues, or actually a couple of them, are the focus of a lot of critics of globalization. That is, the lower regulatory costs and the lower wage costs. I mean, those are part of the story, but it's only part of the story of the considerations. So firms will take a look at all of these things. Now, one thing to certainly note about these costs, and really all of these things, is that the broad calculus of benefits versus costs from foreign activities has changed dramatically in the last 15 or 20 years. As developing countries have liberalized their trade regimes, lowered their tariffs, much more welcoming to to foreign direct investment. They don't restrict it like they used to. They sign trade agreements which encourage foreign direct investment. So the benefits and costs have changed somewhat, in large part because of foreign decisions to organize their economies differently. The U.S. really hasn't changed our policies towards multinationals 20 years. I mean, it's really basically the same. But what has changed is countries like China and Mexico and Brazil have been much more open to foreign direct investment than countries like Japan and Korea in years past, or Mexico, or India, various other countries. So much more welcoming. And that changes the calculus and makes it more likely to have these foreign activities undertaken by U.S. domestic firms.